cost to attack is going down.
And what are the risks that companies most commonly underestimate?
The problem with AI is
Today, we're going to explore how the global services market is changing. We'll explore how India is continuing its role as a major delivery locations and how organizations are balancing cost, resilience, cyber risk, regulation, and control when making outsourcing and offshoring and nearshoring delivery decisions is becoming even more important at the board level. I'm really excited today to be joined by Peter Bendor Samuel. He's the founder and executive chairman of Everest Group. They're one of the leading global advisory and research firms that are focused on IT, business services, outsourcing, and enterprise transformation. And I'm looking forward to the conversation with Peter today, where we'll no doubt discuss artificial intelligence, automation, supply dependencies, and what boards should be considering ahead of major changes to their delivery models. Peter, welcome to the International Risk Podcast.
well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Peter, whereabouts in the world do we find you today?
I'm in Dallas, Texas right now.
Beautiful part of the world. And that's where Everest Group's got its headquarters, I understand.
We do. We this is where we were founded, and we're somewhat of a global firm with offices around the world. London. Most of our people, or 85% of our people, in India, but we have Canada, Argentina, across the U.S. I hate that word global; it's so pretentious, but we're certainly an international firm.
Fantastic. Well, look, I think that's really relevant. You just mentioned with a large part of your workforce in India. India is unquestionably central to the global IT services for decades, and only more so. I wonder, from your perspective, Peter, not just for yourself, but also the research you're doing for clients, is India becoming more important, or is it simply changing its role as its development continues to advance and mature?
So, certainly from India has been the central place in tech services, right, for talent. It's not to say there isn't other low cost locations. There are plenty of them, but it's by far the dominant place for getting talent. The your question seems to imply, look, how are things changing? And the way that the world is changing is AI, and so trying to answer it from an AI, maybe predicated on that understanding. Look, AI. Think of AI as doing two things. It whatever you're applying it to. Let's start with SDLC. SDLC is the software development lifecycle. It's the programming, it's the maintenance, etc. And that, by the way, is the heart of the tech services space. So how is AI affecting SDLC? By the way, as I explain that, you can apply this to all the other functions that in global services. So really it has two things. How does it apply what we're doing today? So in SDLC, every company has an existing tech stack, right? And so how does it apply to maintaining and extending that tech stack, adding to that tech stack? And certainly AI is having or stands to have a significant impact on that space. So right now, for the existing tech stack, the leading service providers and companies are achieving about a 30% productivity when they're applying AI to that. Now, just a little background. When you just give everyone, say, Anthropic and Claude in your SDLC team, you're likely to get about 10% benefit, right? You have to change how you operate to get 30%. Now, as we track that progress forward, and we're doing a lot of studies and working with a lot of people, it is pretty clear that 30% is going 60, maybe 80% over the next 2 or 3 years. So a pretty substantial improvement in productivity. Now, implicit in your question is, will we change the location of people because of AI? And the answer to that looks to be no. Okay, it looks to me that labor arbitrages can continue for the existing maintenance and extension of the existing tech stack. It looks like labor arbitrage is alive and well, although I think at the margin, we have some workloads matriculating back on site. And the argument for the workload matriculate or moving back on site is if you can do in a day what you were doing in a week or a month, then you've got a latency problem on communication. But we're not seeing a lot of that migrating, okay, right now. Not in maintaining the existing tech space. Now, where you are seeing changes is agentic native space. Okay, so where people are developing native agentic systems that are native, then they seem to want to come onshore. They're so dynamic that you need to have this constant communication with the business, and so the latency of time between location is more problematic. Also, the cultural and relationship to the business is more intimate. But to be blunt, most companies have small investments at this point, or at least small footprints. I don't know about small investments, small footprints of agentic native applications. So for the bulk of what we're doing, it's pretty much staying where it is.
And you talk about talent, you talk about India, you talk about the capacity challenges in Europe and North America. And that's certainly not the first time I've heard that, and most of our listeners have probably heard that before. Can you help us understand why? I mean, I was working with one of the globally largest IT consulting firms, and they're obviously providing a lot of IT consulting to large European companies. And one of the things we've seen in Europe over the last 4 or 5 years is an increasing securitization and an increase in protective security regulations. And that means there's a lot more data and a lot more systems that hold and manage and provide services to data that is protected under national legislation in Norway, Sweden, Germany, France, etc. And that means that the staff working with those services require to pass a security clearance, which if you have never stepped foot in the European Union, let alone holding a passport, it's very difficult to pass the required checks. And so the challenge that they were trying to work through with me was how do we work through that? And I pushed back and I said, why can't you find the people in Europe and North America? But I'd love to hear your opinion about. I understand the salaries and the labor arbitrage argument, but why is it so difficult to find these people in Europe and North America?
Well, it's quite frankly primarily a price point. You can there's a market clearing price for anything, and so if you're willing to pay what the market will pay, you can probably find them.
Yeah.
The market's pretty expensive. If your question is why isn't there a bigger supply, that's a good question. I think it's about education, whether people want to go into it, and the demand, quite frankly, increasingly, particularly if we're talking about programming or at least technology. The demand, I guess the term that everyone uses, software is eating the world, right? And just we're spending more and more investment to try and automate or apply technology to our businesses. So the demand is pretty robust, and we have a finite supply, so which drives the price up. So that just isn't the supply. Now, immigration could and does solve for that, but I think increasingly, even in Europe, certainly in the US and certainly in Europe, we're tightening down some of those immigration issues, depending on the country. But largely, it's harder to import the people. So the question is, are you going to import the people? You have to pay them the prevailing wage. It's much higher. To give you a perspective, it could be 5 to 10 times higher. That's a lot. Now, sovereign IT, which is the issue you're dealing with, complicates things, right? So, sovereign IT, both whether it's data or clearance or access, and that's a complicated area. Sometimes sovereign IT is where the data resides. You can have people working in India, but the data resides in Europe. So you can finesse that way. So there's it creates another layer of complications, and it does at the margin move work towards onshots. But again, you've got this cost issue and supply issue, which is just hard to overcome.
And I think most of the companies that I'm working with that either have or are considering moving services to India, the strongest drivers are usually cost, access to talent, scalability, speed. But we're also seeing, this capability and the ability to automate and strategic access to skills that they just can't find, or they just can't find at the right costs. And you talk about being price being the market clearing vehicle, and I think you're right. I think that usually is the number one and the first thing people look at. But and particularly in Europe, as the continent is increasingly concerned about security challenges, there's been nearly 200 confirmed hybrid attacks linked to Russia. There's ongoing, I've got clients that are dealing with espionage cases from foreign state actors. I mean, the security risks in Europe are very, very real, and perhaps Europe has been slow to realize that, but they certainly are seeing it now. From where you sit and with the clients and the research that you're doing, how much is security also a consideration these days?
Let's decompose that, right? I mean, so yes, black hat community. I mean, if you kind of look at security, the cost to attack is going down, and AI tools are bringing the cost for the black hats to come down. And you're right, you have state-sponsored black hats as well as commercially spawned hats, and sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. So, and certainly that their ability to attack and the cost for each attack is dropping dramatically, right? At the same time, the surface area in which they can attack is expanding. So AI both creates a drop in the price for them to attack, as well as a much bigger surface area for them to attack across. So yeah, it's a real concern. Now, you seem to imply that that would cause people to do more onshore or offshore. Well, no, the more, I mean, to some degree, that drives, I need more resources to defend, okay, and I have to be able to afford those resources. If you're being attacked out of Russia or China or Iran, having your support out of India doesn't stop that. It's more about the software and the people paying attention to do that. So now the sovereign IT, which is a different issue, and it may be influenced by the same set of concerns, um, could affect it. But the growing effectiveness and size of the black hat community and the surface area they can attack us really causes us to have to spend more money on this, and we want our money to go as far. We want to be as effective. And again, if there's a scarce resources, I can't find them. I need to find them quickly. I need to be able to get 10 of them, not one of them. So that tends to drive more work offshore.
And so at the same time, as you said, the cost to attack is decreasing, the surface area expanding. Companies are looking for increasing ways to reduce costs whilst maintaining their resilience, their cybersecurity, increasingly regulatory expectations in Europe. Not only do we have things like GDPR and NIS2, we've also got DORA. There's a lot of heavy regulations, as well as the US has, of course, as well. How do organizations balance all this with cost reductions, maintaining security, complying with regulations?
Well, I mean, to some degree, you can decompose this way. If you're going to have to spend more on security, you're going to have to find the savings somewhere else. And that doesn't exactly work that because although they're loosely correlated budgets, they're not tightly correlated, right? But yes, there's an ongoing pressure to be more cost effective, and some of our costs are rising, and it just accentuates the need to be more cost effective somewhere else, and more cost effective in our defenses. Um, and again, you got these other complications of sovereign IT and regulations, which further complicate that. But that tends to add to cost, not reduce cost.
And when you talk about data sovereignty, I mean, if we think about the regulated sectors generally, healthcare, finance, banking, insurance, what are you seeing? Are they doing more or less offshoring, and where they locate their services?
In general, we're seeing we're seeing the labor arbitrage driven tech services space really having flattened out. We don't see it recovering to the 5%, and this is for the traditional space. Okay, and that's across BPO, SDLC, you know, or all the other areas. So it's the broad market. What we are seeing is happening is um, firms are trying to do more themselves. So there's an insourcing move, and the tip of that spear is within India or within the offshore community. So rather than using more and more third-party services, they're building their own GCCs, global centers or GBSs, GCCs, and they're able to put work they don't trust third parties with or don't want third parties doing into the GCCs because they have control over it. Back to the regulations, other issues. Um, and they've also figured out that, look, they believe it's cheaper to do it themselves than they're no longer intimidated about building a facility or having a facility in India or the Philippines. So well, we've definitely seen the GCCs grow at the expense of the third parties. So that's where the big shift has happened. What we haven't seen is a repatriation of work from offshore to onshore. And though we've seen a slowdown in the rate of moving from onshore offshore, but it hasn't stopped completely.
Interesting. Okay. And Peter, I'll just take a minute to remind our listeners that if you prefer to watch your podcast, the International Risk Podcast is always available on YouTube. So please go to YouTube and search for the International Risk Podcast. And please do, if you like our content, do share it with a friend or a colleague. Now, Peter, you mentioned the Philippines, Poland, Ukraine, just then when you were talking about that. And I think that's really important. When we speak a lot on the International Risk Podcast about geopolitics and about a variety of issues around that. So, what should executives be thinking if they're starting to ponder offshoring or considering new offshoring options? How do they balance, the Gulf states, India, Latin America, Eastern Europe, the Philippines? How do they start that conversation or start that analysis about where they should be basing it, other than just cost?
Well, it's like, that famous quote, other than that, how was the play, Mrs. Lincoln? So cost is always relevant in that conversation. So what are other the factors that go into making a decision? Well, the talent. So just give me an example. Poland went from being very cheap, but also having a lot of particularly GCCs go in, right? And now they have a large community of talented people that people can take advantage of. The problem with that is now with everyone going in, demand and supply, there's more demand, less supply, so the prices in Poland have risen very dramatically. So it's access to talent, the right kind of talent. Um, and that changes by the function and the industry. Another factor is proximity. I think Eastern Europe has been very attractive for Europe because of its proximity. It's 2 time zones away. When you get beyond 2 time zones, it starts to get awkward. Within 2 time zones, you don't have any material friction on issues. So time zone proximity, stability. There's why was Ukraine such an attractive place? Well, it was cheap, had outstanding engineering, but you also had in Ukraine very, very loyal employees. They didn't move very fast. Another one is language. Um, do they speak the local language or your language? So if you're doing business in French, Morocco or French-speaking areas are very attractive, less friction. Now that particular one is likely to drop. We've got some immediate translation vehicles through AI now, which reduce that, but most people aren't using them right now. So language, time zone, the type of labor, the stability of the labor, all those are factors that go into making a selection.
And how big a issue? Because I've done quite a few investigations for European firms with companies or subsidiaries in India, and nearly for all investigations that I've done there, the high turnover of staff has been one of the contributing factors for a variety of issues. But when looking at outsourcing, how big an issue? And you mentioned the volatility and the high turnover workforce in India. How big a consideration is that? And for anyone that hasn't pondered that before, why is that a big consideration?
It really depends on the executives making the decision. right? So, for example, and this is where you find Europe being different from North America. In North America, they're much more focused on price. In Europe, they're putting more weight on terms of language, in terms of uh, stability of workforce, etc. Which is why you had a huge expansion in Eastern Europe, right? First, and most of Eastern Europe was Europe facing, not North America facing. Um, Time zone, talent, other issues. But it also changes by how urgent the problem is. I mean, if you're facing a big business disruption and you have to make immediate moves to cut costs, then that's what you're probably going to go to the cheap location quickly. Now, I'm talking about in-house GCC. With returns of the using a third party, an outsourcer, you're really looking at the quality of the outsourcer, where they have what their price is going to change by the location in which they provide it out of. But you're relying more on their reputation and commitments.
And what are the risks that companies most commonly underestimate when they're moving either their IT infrastructure or their IT operations or support functions offshore? What do you see as the risks that people commonly overlook?
There's all kinds of risk. Um, I think the biggest thing you tend to underestimate is how quickly it can happen. Whether you have a contract to do it or otherwise, getting that organization stood up and really working well takes longer than you think it's going to. Another big miss is just how much you're going to have to spend on governance and oversight. That's particularly an issue for third parties, where people tend to miss that. In all that, you can rush past some of the security and other issues. I mean, if the more you change, the more things you have to keep track of. And if you're doing it primarily for cost reductions, the temptation is to have a thin team and lose track of some of these things. This is where you get your gaps on security or gaps in resilience. Though, quite frankly, I mean, if you look at the total of all the outsourcing and GCC's captives that have been done, it's been very successful. There's only been these failures are always brought up, but very high success rate.
What the DORA, which is the European Union's Digital Operations Resilience Act, which came into effect 2025, and it's had a big impact. It's a complement to NIS2, and it's something that a lot of companies have had to really look at and review and step up to meet the required standards. And a big part of DORA talks about concentration risk, and I think for me, I still haven't got my head around this one, Peter. So I'm really keen to hear your thoughts because when companies rely on a large supplier of any sort, and in this case, a technology supplier, there's going to be concentration risk because generally they'll rely on one. They generally don't rely on and split it and rely on two technology providers to avoid concentration risk. So, how do companies balance this concentration risk with efficient outsourcing?
Well, first of all, concentration risk isn't just with a single vendor. Okay, you can have concentration risk in having all of your work being done in Ukraine. Now, you can use the same vendor if you have diverse delivery centers. So for example, I've got a delivery center in Bangalore and another delivery center in Poland and another one in so I can concentration risk is managed. It's not just one thing. You can have vendor concentration, you have location concentration risk, you can have tech concentration risk. You're overly dependent on so yeah, it's a very complicated area. And what DORA does is add regulation. I mean, it highlights those risks that were often overlooked.
Mm.
Okay. And now you don't have the ability to and they may overestimate some risks, but regulators are regulators, and you have to pay attention. You have to demonstrate you have governance over it. So it increases your governance cost and your design cost. One of the thing about regulations is often that we end up doing things for regulation sense, but we haven't really addressed the risk. So, for example, let's talk about a multi-vendor strategy versus a single vendor strategy. You can have a multi-vendor strategy, but still have everyone concentrated in Bangalore. You've still got a city risk. Um, uh, but more importantly, most likely you have the vendors you in different areas. So you'll have one vendor doing or one provider doing infrastructure management, another one doing apps. Well, okay. Uh, I've got my problem with infrastructure. If it goes wrong, I'm dead. Okay, how much have you really reduced? So you're unlike in the risk of having multiple vendors inside of, say, infrastructure might be greater because of the coordination and friction than having a single vendor that you adequately manage. So yeah, risk is ever changing, and the DORA and other regulations kind of prescribe how you have to think about it. I'm not sure it always adequately addresses the underlying risk.
And you talked about, and I think that's a spot on. That's the difference between that tick box exercise versus genuinely actually identifying and then mitigating the risk. But you brought up two things that I think are spot on, Peter, and that's about adequately managing it. And you also talked about how companies might have to, quickly look at outsourcing in order to cut costs. One of the things that I would recommend to organizations, if they're going to do that, they still need to maintain enough internal capacity in order to govern, in order to challenge their contractors, and if necessary, they need the capacity to manage an exit from a service provider if something goes wrong. How do organizations maintain that? Is that a balance, or is that something
Well,
you?
it's one of the reasons why we see this move, why we see the pendulum moving more to in
Mm,
insourcing, but in a low cost location rather than third parties, because I think the 20, 30 years ago we largely ignored those issues. Okay, I think with those firms with some experience, and now we have more experience in the industry. We and now we have regulators that are more tuned into those things. We're being either through experience or through regulation being forced to address those in a more robust way. And so, what looks like a 30% savings turns into a 15 or 12% savings because of the uh, oversight, governance, and friction that provides.
Peter, if this was an earnings call, we definitely would have failed on the grading sheet when it comes to how many times we've mentioned artificial intelligence. So I feel like I need to ask you a little bit more about that. When it comes to outsourcing, when it comes to managed services and delivery center economics, we've talked so much about the cost reductions. Have you seen any significant and real changes? We've talked. There's so much discussion about, is AI changing the way businesses run, or is it just hype, or is it just AI washing? What are you seeing when it comes to AI and how it's changing outsourcing and managed services?
Well, it set off a very aggressive price competition. We're experiencing intense pricing pressure, downward pricing pressure, and fundamentally, it's the expectation of clients. Well, it what's driving it is a reducing TAM for SDLC or other areas. You can't, if you're a public company, see your revenues go down, so you have to take share, and that creates just increasing competitive tension. So we're seeing pricing drop, and if you're not seeing it drop, you're not looking. Okay, so we're seeing it's a very intense pricing environment. In terms of the delivery itself, I think I mentioned that earlier. I think the problem with AI is, as we talked about the situation, just giving people the tools doesn't give you a significant unlock. Something in the range of 10% is what we're seeing. You have to change how you operate. So you don't in AI, you don't get significant unlock until you change how you operate. And changing how you operate is a very there's high risk,
Hmm.
okay, because the risk of failure is high, um, and it takes time. So I think we're starting to see that go through the operations. What we're seeing a lot of right now with AI is it's creating a lot of vendor consolidation. So a lot of the symptoms we see right now are people saying, look, I've got 10, 20 vendors in my mix. I know I'm going to use AI. Trying to do that across a portfolio of 20 vendors is ridiculous. Let me get that down to 2 or 3, right? Back to concentration risk. But the issue here is if I'm going to drive AI transformation, I need to do it with fewer people that are better qualified. So we're seeing a vendor consolidation move driven by AI. I mean, the big issue that firms are struggling with, I was out to dinner with a CEO late last week, and this is a software company, and the issue of AI came up, and he said, "Yeah, look, we're using it, so let's just take the development area." He said, "But here's my problem. My roadmap is exactly the same before I gave them Claude. Hasn't changed. The team size hasn't changed. So I'm spending the same amount of people. Actually, those who have developed skills in Claude now cost me more. So my team size the same. I pay more for the teams, and I'm paying a ton of money to Claude for token uses. So he says, as far as I can see, it's costing me more right now, not less. He says, as far as I can see, the quality of the code coming out is not better. Okay, that's the CEO. Right? And I think a lot of firms struggle with that right now, which is the case of if you just add the tool, you don't do very much. If you have to change how you operate to get the significant unlock. And I think that's happening quite a lot throughout the industry, where people are seeing rogue token usage. That thing can balloon out pretty quickly. You can spend hundreds of thousands of dollars or euros very quickly. You don't see it coming, you can't anticipate it, and all of a sudden, so you have to change how you operate if you're going to get the lock. And we really don't have the tools to really control token usage right now. There's a disconnect between the personal incentive to use it and the teams and the company's benefit of using it. So we're still in the early days of this. That said, we've got a lot of demonstrated use cases where people are getting a total 30+% reduction in cost, but they really had to re-engineer it to get there.
No, thanks for explaining that. And I think there's actually a really good thought paper on the Everest Group website about that, about rethinking business models to harness the AI advantage. So I encourage our listeners to look at that, and we'll include that in the show notes below. But Peter, your team's often working on some really great work. Is there anything particularly exciting that you're able to share? Is there any exciting projects or research that's coming out in the near future that you're particularly interested in?
Well, we're very interested in the AI issue. So I kind of set this up earlier. There's a real difference between using AI to do a better job of what you're doing and then doing something completely different, right? And we define that as the native AI space, right? This is really exciting. This is where we're often seeing where people succeed at this at 10 times unlock in terms of ROI. Well, 10 times, I mean, historically, global services all got predicated off a 20 to 25% benefit. 10 times is, well, a lot more.
Yep.
Okay. So and I think we now have a really clear understanding of I'm sure there are going to be multiple archetypes of how you design these systems, but we have pretty clear vision of how at least the current dominant archetype is going to form, right? And I think this is really interesting. So I'm going to go nerdy on you, but you did ask the AI question, so I'm going to nerd out for you. So whether it's infrastructure management or claims or payments, I mean, typically what we're seeing is an ontology is being built. Now, an ontology it's the data, but knowing what the data means. So it's sort of it's all very one thing to feed everything into an LLM, but when you've spent the time to really understand what you're looking at, what it gives you is observability. You can observe in machine time what is really happening. By the way, from a security perspective, this is potentially the answer we have to the black hat problem. We can see in machine time what is happening. Observability. Often paired with this ontology is a digital twin. Okay, and a digital twin is a virtual representation of the environment that I'm managing or operating, or the function I'm operating. And what a twin gives you is the ability to anticipate what will happen. So observability is what is happening in real time, in machine time. A digital twin, what could happen or what is likely to happen given different conditions in machine time. So those are the foundation elements of that. And that can be applied to a claims process, to payments process, to marketing. It's a very broad set of applications. Sitting on top of that is a gateway, which we, in a harness, which allows us to then take advantage of that observability and that anticipation. And what we end up with is what we try to engineer is accountability. Is it going to do the right thing? And is it going to do it at the right cost? And then you have an AI fabric that sits on top that take action on those things. That's a very powerful structure, and it has the potential to be applied broadly across enterprises, whether it's the functions we're talking about. Now, it's different from maintaining the same systems you've got and extending them. It's a completely native environment. It's also very dynamic, but it has the potential for very high ROI. That's really exciting.
Yep. No, that makes a lot of sense, Peter. And look, thank you very much for coming on the International Risk Podcast today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
It was my pleasure.
Fantastic. Well, that was a great conversation with Peter Bender-Samuel. He's the founder and executive chairman of the Everest Group. Thanks very much for joining us today, Peter. I'm Dominic Bowen, your host. We'll see you again in the next couple of days.